All right, class. Chapter 2 talks about the ethical basis of law and business management. This is not a class on ethics. This is a class on legal foundations. And as we kind of talked about in week 1, chapter 1, ethics is tied to the entire concept of the rule of law. This is how we treat people, that nobody is above the rules. That being said, I am not here to give you a lecture on what you should not be doing in business or your personal lives. That's not what I do. If anything, as a lawyer, I do what my clients tell me to do as long as their security retainer check clears the bank. So, what we are really looking at in terms of ethics is how do businesses make decisions? And there are a variety of ways that that happens. But ultimately, we're talking about what is right and wrong, but also how do we just choose a moral compass? And this moral compass doesn't necessarily have to be as biblical as it sounds or as set in stone, but this is literally just how do we share our values to promote what we do in the community as a corporation, and how do we move forward? So there are two general categories of ethics things are going to fall into: formalism and consequentialism. Again, this is not super important for what we're talking about here. What I am more interested in you guys reviewing and talking about is where do we get these business ethics? And there are different schools of thought here. Some of them come from individual values. These are things you've learned from religion, from your parents, from your social groups. Sometimes they are forced upon us, like a professional code of ethics. As a lawyer, there are certain things that I can and cannot do, or else I will lose my license to practice. One of the more well known ones is that if you retain a lawyer or you consult with a lawyer, you now have attorney client privilege. And that attorney is sworn to secrecy and has to keep in confidence anything you told them. This includes whether you've committed crimes, you've done all kinds of horrible things. And this is also one of the most well respected and ironclad pieces of confidentiality there is in our legal system. So, for example, you come into my office, you tell me you murdered 10 people over the weekend, you tell me where the bodies are buried. There is nothing and no one that can force me to tell the police that information. They put me on the stand, I will refuse to testify. And nothing will happen because we have an attorney client communication. The only exception to that is if you are going to murder 10 people next weekend and you tell me your plan. I do then have a duty to protect people if I can and inform the authorities. So if you're telling me something in advance, don't do that. If you're telling me something that you've done in the past, you're good. I can't share that with anyone. But that is a professional code of ethics that benefits you as a client, but I'm also bound to that. Literally, if I got on the stand and testified against some serial killer or mass murderer, I could lose my license to practice law. You also, ultimately, what we're going to be talking about is legal regulation. There are rules that the government has established and our society has established of how corporations should and should not act. That is ultimately what we're going to be talking about, what I care about the most in terms of this class. That being said, we want to talk about why those things come about, how they come about. Legal formalism cuts both ways. This is an idea of how we make rules. We don't rules reflect how things work practically in the real world. But there's also a movement that started kind of in the 80s in terms of if it's legal, it's fine. Let's do it. There's not a matter of right or wrong. It's just the analysis whether it's legal or not. And there's starting to be a lot of pushback that I'd say kind of in the early 2010s. It's starting to come back full circle where people are trying to be more involved in their community and do quote unquote good things from that perspective. And again, sometimes you'll belong to an organization that's going to lay out their own set of ethics themselves. We're going to talk about more of that in the assignments in week 1. So there are certain ethical rules that are drawn from this legal basis. Things like liberty, fundamental rights, good faith, due care, confidentiality, and conflict of interest. These do have legal ramifications for certain professions and certain people in certain situations, but more often these are referred to in ethical situations. You may have a duty to act in good faith in a business negotiation from a legal perspective, but most people are going to look at that as just a good person moral duty. Again, I am not so concerned about that, but what I want you guys to look at from the perspective of a manager or a business manager is how do your ethical values in making a business decision impact your business, yourself, your clients, your employees. Basically, where does that decision stop trickling down, and when does it stop being positive versus negative? So, I want to walk you through an example. This is a real example that happens all the time. So, you are hired to build a brick wall. They're going to pay you $300. It's going to take you all day. There's no able to negotiate the price. You can't do it later. It has to be done tomorrow. Before you get started, you get a phone call. And a guy on the other side of town needs you to build the exact same wall, exact same materials, and he's going to pay you $1,000. What do you do? You can't build both walls. You don't have time, resources, or manpower. So you have to choose which wall do you build. The $300 wall, you signed a contract, you made a promise, you said you'd be there, or the $1,000 wall. Now, there are legal consequences to your choice. You could be sued for breach of contract if you don't build the first wall. That being said, you are still going to make more money even if you get sued and lose for breach of contract if you build the $1,000 wall. This is the situation that comes up all the time in business, and I have clients that on both sides of the fence. I have some clients that were going to build that $300 wall no matter what because they gave their word. And that comes from a religious practice for some clients, that comes from an old school mentality. I gave my word, it's ironclad way of doing business. I have other clients that are going to build that $1,000 wall every single time, and they will happily pay the damages to the first guy where they breach the contract because it's about money. They need to keep the lights on to feed their employees. They need to hire people. They need to feed their own families as well. There is no right or wrong answer to this. This is one of those fun ethical dilemmas that we love to talk about in business school, but it really does occur and appear in real life as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'd love to hear you guys share some of this on the discussion forum. But ultimately, those are the kind of ethical questions and ethical decisions that we are looking for. Again, not super concerned about the morality of what you guys are doing, as long as you can justify it to yourselves and to your employees. But it is going to be helpful to have a system or a code where you can make these decisions on a consistent basis. A lot of times that is what companies refer to as a mission statement. And sometimes that mission statement involves a morality or a religious ethos behind it. Again, I don't care. It is up to you, but this is something I really want you guys to think about and think through why companies make these decisions.